It was 40 years ago this past Thursday that Senator Robert Kennedy was gunned down in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel, moments after he won the California primary and was well on the road to becoming the Democratic presidential nominee. A gunman was wrestled to the ground, tried, convicted, and sentenced to life in prison. Sirhan Sirhan has been judged the lone shooter. But a new documentary and book suggest otherwise. The book, Who Killed Bobby, and the documentary, RFK Must Die, The Assassination of Bobby Kennedy, that airs tomorrow night on the Documentary Channel, claim that Kennedy was the victim of a wide conspiracy. The author documentarian is Shane O'Sullivan, who is with us in the studio. Thanks so much for coming in.
You're welcome.
So, if it wasn't Sirhan Sirhan, who was it?
Well, there's a new analysis of the only known audio recording of the shooting, which has literally just been analysed in the last few months, and that seems to indicate that 13 shots were fired in the pantry and that 2 gunmen were involved. So the identity of that second gunman is still kind of unresolved at this point, but it seems from that analysis that Sirhan Sirhan wasn't the killer of Robert Kennedy.
Now, the police investigation found there were, 8 shots, weren't there?
The police accounting of the bullets was very careful because they knew that Sirhan's gun could only hold 8 bullets. Therefore, there were 3 shots that hit Bobby Kennedy's body, 1 shot that went through the shoulder pad of his coat and exited, and then 5 bystanders were injured. So by simple math, we're right up there at the threshold of what 8 bullets can do at that point. But then witnesses and also police officers saw bullet holes in the pantry, quite aside from the injuries to the bystanders and to Kennedy. So there's always been a suspicion that there were more than 8 shots fired. Some witnesses thought they heard more than 8 shots, and now we have this audio recording which seems to indicate that there were in fact 13 shots.
It seems incredulous to think this was 40 years ago. I mean, those of us who remember it well, it only seems like it was so recent and such a horror and such a tragedy. I want to take a look from your documentary of that moment, frozen in our collective consciousness. This was the moment in California 40 years ago.
My thanks to all of you, and now it's on to Chicago, and let's win there.
Moments later, he was assassinated.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Yesterday, my dad. I am right here. Rafer Johnson has a hold of a man who apparently has fired the shot. He still has the gun. The gun is pointed at me at this moment. I hope they can get the gun out of his hand. Get the gun. Get the gun. His hand is frozen. Get his thumb. Get his thumb. Take a hold of his thumb and break it if you have to. Get his thumb. Okay, now hold on to the guy. Hold on to him. Hold on to him, ladies and gentlemen. They have the gun away from the man.
24-year-old Palestinian Sirhan Sirhan is seen firing at Kennedy in a kitchen pantry and is arrested as the lone assassin. And notebooks at his house seem to incriminate him. He carries the motive in his shirt pocket, a newspaper clipping about Kennedy's promise to sell 50 bombers to Israel.
And that commentary was by Shane O'Sullivan, who's produced this film, RFK Must Die, The Assassination of Bobby Kennedy, on the Documentary Channel tomorrow night. So that was the motive. That was determined. But you still say that your new shocking revelations, why has it taken 40 years to come up with this?
Well, I think that this audio recording was sitting in a vault in the archives for years, and it was little known and it was little analysed. So that's only happened in the last few months. And I think also the motivation, it seemed clear-cut at the time because these notebooks were found. Sirhan had written RFK must die, RFK must be assassinated in his notebook. But the date when he actually wrote that was May 18th. And the motivation seemed to be because Kennedy had, in perhaps reaching out to the Jewish voters, had promised to send bombers to Israel. But he only started pledging support for Israel on May 20th, and he only mentioned the bombers on May 26th, which is just a few weeks before the shooting. Yet we have Sirhan writing in his notebook on May 18th, before Kennedy even, advised about this support for Israel, that he wanted to kill Kennedy. So there's some sort of disconnect there between Sirhan's apparent motivation and why he wrote in these notebooks and how it came to pass that he did this very strange writing.
It's somewhat curious that his assassination 5 years after the assassination of his brother and the conspiracy theories abound about the shooting death of JFK, as it does now about with Bobby. There are people who are going to challenge these findings and say, another conspiracy theorist. How do you defend what you have found?
Well, I think we have to draw a line between, what is the hard kind of forensic evidence and then what is kind of hypothesis building on that. So the hard forensic facts are that all of the witnesses saw the muzzle of Sirhan's gun 1.5 to 5 feet in front of the senator, and the autopsy tells us that the fatal shot came from 1 inch behind. So there's always been a disconnect there between, how could Sirhan have got his gun behind Kennedy when all the witnesses saw him in front? 2 key witnesses were actually standing between Sirhan and Kennedy, and they insist and have insisted for years that there's no way Sirhan could have fired the shot described in the autopsy. So now we have this new audio recording which seems to indicate that there was in fact a second shooter, and that Sirhan, even though he fired in the pantry and was seen firing, didn't actually fire the fatal shot.
Sound can be so deceiving. I think the sound in Dealey Plaza in Dallas in the shooting of President Kennedy was a question. Also, the way sound reverberates and bounces off buildings in an open space.
Yeah.
Could this be the same situation in closed space in the kitchen of the Ambassador Hotel?
Well, I think the Phil Van Praek, who's done that analysis, has been very careful to examine, whether they could be ricochets, whether they could be pots and pans, or whether they could be balloons popping, because there's lots of balloons. But yeah, I mean, the mass of a bullet is very different from the mass of a ricochet or the mass of a balloon popping. So he's been very careful to discount that, to test fire the type of guns that were involved, to see if they measure up against the sounds in this recording. And he's convinced that he has 13 shots.
You also bring out in the book and the documentary other factors, including the presence of what you called were CIA operatives in the kitchen that night. Tell us about that.
That's a little bit inconclusive at this point. We have a leading CIA operative from the 60s, David Sanchez Morales, who was the chief of operations at the CIA's base in Miami and led a lot of the plots to assassinate Castro or try and invade Cuba at some point after the Bay of Pigs. So in 1973, in a hotel room, he said to his best friend and his former attorney, I was in Dallas when we got the SOB, and I was in Los Angeles when we got the little SOB. Choicer words were used. But basically, I interviewed both of those men who were close associates of him, and he seemed to intimate that he was in Dallas and he was in Los Angeles, and that he was involved in both assassinations. So, again, I take that very seriously, that he may have been on the ground involved in this. And that also goes to the fact that many people think Sirhan was programmed, that he was, the defense psychiatrist believes he was in a hypnotic state at the time of the shooting. And we know Congress verified in the 70s that the CIA had been conducting experiments since the early 50s to try and create just such a Manchurian candidate.
Manchurian candidate?
Exactly.
So what was the motive? What was behind it? If this was a conspiracy, who was behind it? There were so many theories about JFK. They said it was Castro, organized crime.
Yeah.
What about Bobby? Who would have been behind it if your theory is correct?
Well, I feel in 68, Bobby, filled with compassion and grief after the death of his brother, had really reached out to the people. He'd worked on the war on poverty. He'd helped the great pickers in Delano. He was a champion of the black and Hispanic minorities. He was going to pull out of Vietnam. He was really going to lead the country in a different direction. And I think that was perhaps against the interests of the establishment, be they military-industrial complex or whatever you want to call it. So, I think to me that's the motivation.
Shocking and very controversial. There'll be a lot of people who will be challenging you on that, people who say they debunk all these conspiracy theories, but I know you've worked on it for a number of years. The book is called Who Killed Bobby? The documentary RFK, the assassination of Bobby Kennedy, tomorrow night on the documentary channel. Shane O'Sullivan, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And that is our program for this week. If you have any comments or wish to see this broadcast again, log on to our website at cw11.com/newscloseup. I'm Marvin Scott. Thanks so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Sunday, everyone.
Thank you.